Leah Torres had seen it all during her 3 years behind the checkout counter at Hartwell Green Store 487. But on this Tuesday afternoon in April, something about the man in aisle 7 caught her attention in a way that made her heart ache. He stood there for what felt like forever, holding a loaf of generic white bread in one hand and counting crumpled bills with the other. His jacket had seen better days, faded denim with a small tear near the left shoulder. His jeans were clean but worn thin at the knees. Everything about him screamed financial struggle, from the way he carefully examined each price tag to how he kept putting items back on the shelf. Have you ever looked at someone and made assumptions about their life based on what they're buying? We all do it. The woman with the expensive wine and organic vegetables clearly has money. The college student with instant ramen and energy drinks is obviously broke. But sometimes appearances can be deceiving in ways that will absolutely blow your mind. Leah watched as the stranger, who looked to be in his mid-40s with salt and pepper stubble, picked up a small container of store-brand peanut butter. He studied the label, then checked his handful of quarters again. The math wasn't working in his favor. She could see him debating whether to choose the peanut butter or the bread, because clearly he couldn't afford both. That's when her heart made the decision for her. This man looked desperate, and Leah knew desperate. She'd been living it for 2 years, ever since her son's diagnosis turned their world upside down. She recognized the careful calculations, the quiet shame of counting change in public, the weight of choosing between necessities. "Excuse me," she called out during her 15-minute break, walking over to aisle 7. "I'm Leah. I work here and I noticed you might be looking for work. We're actually hiring if you're interested." The stranger looked up, and she noticed his eyes were kind. Tired, but kind. That's incredibly generous of you to offer," he said quietly. "I'm Lucas Grant." What Leah didn't know was that she'd just offered a job to the man who owned the entire 1,200-store chain she worked for. But what if everything you thought you knew about someone was completely wrong? Before we explore this incredible story, smash that like button if you've ever helped a stranger, and comment below about a time when someone surprised you. The man Leah knew as Lucas Grant was actually Brandon Hartwell, CEO and majority shareholder of the Hartwell Green Consortium, a grocery empire worth $3,200,000,000 that employed over 47,000 people across 1,200 stores nationwide. At 62, he should have been celebrating the success story of a lifetime. Instead, he was questioning everything he'd built. 3 weeks earlier, Brandon had received an anonymous letter that shattered his perception of his own company. Postmarked from Cedar Ridge, Colorado, home to Store 487, it came from someone claiming to be a cashier. The words were typed, direct, and devastating. "You've become exactly what your father fought against. A profiteer feeding shareholders while starving the people who stock your shelves." The letter detailed wage theft, expired food being relabeled, and a culture of fear that prevented employees from speaking up about safety violations. But what haunted Brandon most was the final paragraph. "We're rationing insulin because your generous health plan doesn't cover basic medications. You've forgotten that behind every transaction is a human being trying to survive." Brandon's journey to this moment began in 1987 when he was 24, fresh out of community college, working in his father's butcher shop in rural Ohio. With $12,000, 0 cents in savings, and a dream, he opened Hartwell's Pantry, a modest grocery store built on the principle of feeding families, not corporations. His father, a man who knew every customer's name and their kids' birthdays, had taught him that business was about relationships, not just revenue. For 18 years, that philosophy worked beautifully. By 2005, Hartwell's Pantry had grown to 50 locations, each managed by someone who owned a 10% stake in their store. Brandon still visited every location monthly, stocking shelves alongside employees, learning their stories, celebrating their successes. But success bred complexity. The 2010 merger with Green Valley Organics created the Hartwell Green Consortium, catapulting them into national prominence. Suddenly, monthly visits became quarterly. Quarterly became annual. Annual became orchestrated events where nervous managers stage-managed every interaction to show Brandon only what they thought he wanted to see. Automated inventory systems replaced personal relationships with suppliers. Centralized procurement squeezed out the local farmers his father had championed. Profit margins began dictating shelf space over community needs. The company had grown so large that Brandon found himself managing spreadsheets instead of people, attending board meetings instead of walking store aisles. Corporate metrics showed Cedar Ridge Store 487 was performing within acceptable parameters. But the anonymous letter suggested a reality that contradicted every report crossing his desk. If the allegations were true, his life's work had become a monument to everything he once opposed. That's when Brandon made a decision that would have shocked his board of directors. He was going undercover, working with a Hollywood prosthetics team, the same company that transformed actors for major films. Brandon became Lucas Grant, a 45-year-old divorced father relocating to Cedar Ridge for custody reasons. Colored contacts masked his distinctive green eyes, professional makeup aged him down and changed his facial structure. A carefully curated thrift store wardrobe completed the transformation. His executive team believed he was taking a 3-week sabbatical to hike the Appalachian Trail, something he'd mentioned wanting to do for years. Meanwhile, Store 487's management received notice of a routine corporate ethics inspection, scheduled for late April, buying him the time he needed. Standing outside Store 487 on April 3rd, wearing a faded denim jacket and carrying a backpack with his fake employment history, Brandon felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: genuine nervousness. Not the controlled tension of board presentations or shareholder meetings, but the raw anxiety of someone desperately needing a job. He was about to enter his own store as a stranger, hoping to discover whether the company bearing his name had retained any trace of his father's values, or if it had become the very type of corporation they'd once sworn to never emulate. What he would find in the next 3 weeks would change not just him, but the lives of every person who worked under the Hartwell Green banner. Lucas Grant clocked in at 6:47 a.m. on April 3rd, wearing a name tag that felt heavier than any corporate title he'd ever held. Store manager Brenda Walsh barely looked up from her clipboard as she assigned him to stock duty under assistant manager Derek Lowe, a man whose permanent scowl suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Within his first hour, Brandon witnessed something that made his stomach turn. He watched shift supervisor Janet instructing 2 employees to peel USDA choice stickers off beef packages and replace them with Prime labels, a practice that justified charging customers an extra $4 per pound for identical meat. "But isn't that fraud?" whispered Tommy, a 19-year-old college student working part-time. "It's profit optimization," Janet snapped back. "Corporate says we need to hit our margins, and this is how we do it. You got a problem with feeding your family?" Tommy fell silent, and Brandon understood why. In this economy, questioning management meant risking the only income keeping you afloat. By 9 a.m., the revelations kept coming. Brandon observed an elderly bagger named Frank, struggling with obvious arthritis pain, repeatedly asking for a stool to rest between customers. His requests were denied by Derek, who claimed it looked unprofessional and would encourage laziness in other workers. Frank continued standing for his 8-hour shift, occasionally gripping the checkout counter when the pain became overwhelming. The break room told its own story of neglect. 4 employees shared a single microwave that barely functioned, its interior stained with what appeared to be weeks of accumulated food spills. The smell was nauseating. A handwritten sign taped to the wall read, "Water fountain broken since February. Management says parts are on order." That was 2 months ago, but it was the fear that shocked Brandon most. Conversations stopped when Derek approached. Eye contact was avoided when management walked by. During lunch, employees huddled in corners, speaking in hushed tones about scheduling conflicts, denied time-off requests, and the unspoken rule that complaints led to reduced hours, or worse. You see that camera? Maria, a single mother stocking shelves beside him, pointed discreetly toward the ceiling. That's new. They say it's for security, but we all know it's watching us, making sure we don't take too many bathroom breaks or spend too long helping customers. Each discovery felt like a knife to everything Brandon thought he'd built. This wasn't the company his father would have recognized. This wasn't the business model that had earned him recognition as a working-class capitalist. This was exploitation dressed up in corporate efficiency language. The breaking point came during his third day, when Brandon noticed a strong chemical smell near the produce section. Following his nose, he discovered refrigerant leaking from a damaged cooling line, a serious safety hazard that could affect both workers and customers. The leak had clearly been present for days, based on the staining pattern on the floor. He approached Derek with what he thought was helpful information. "Hey, there's a refrigerant leak in produce section B. Shouldn't we call maintenance?" Derek's response was swift and threatening. "Listen here, Lucas. You want to keep this job? Eyes down, hands busy. We don't get paid to play safety inspector or hero. That leak's been reported. Corporate will fix it when they feel like it. Until then, you stock shelves and keep your mouth shut." The message was clear. Worker safety was secondary to maintaining productivity. Speaking up about hazards was discouraged, not rewarded. The very company policies Brandon had approved from his boardroom were being interpreted in ways that put people at risk. That night, sitting in his modest hotel room, Brandon felt trapped by his own creation. He couldn't reveal his identity without ending the investigation, but staying silent meant watching human beings suffer under policies bearing his signature. Every corporate directive he'd approved to streamline operations or maximize efficiency had translated into real hardship for real families. Can you imagine discovering your life's work had become everything you stood against? Let us know in the comments what you'd do in this situation. The anonymous letter writer had been understating the problems. Cedar Ridge wasn't just failing to live up to Hartwell Green's stated values, it was actively violating them. Workers weren't just underpaid, they were intimidated into silence about legitimate safety concerns. Customers weren't just overcharged, they were being deceived about what they were buying. Worse yet, Brandon realized this wasn't unique to Store 487. If these practices were happening here, under corporate radar, how many other locations were operating the same way? How many thousands of employees across his 1,200-store empire were suffering under similar conditions? The man who had built his fortune on feeding families, not corporations, had somehow created a machine that was devouring both. On his fourth day, fate partnered Brandon with the woman who had changed everything. Leah Torres, the cashier who'd offered him a lifeline when she thought he was just another desperate job seeker. Working alongside her during the afternoon shift, he began to understand why her kindness had felt so genuine that first day. She wasn't just helping a stranger. She was helping someone she recognized as walking the same difficult path she'd traveled daily. "You remind me of my neighbor back in Phoenix," Leah said during their 15-minute break, the maximum allowed under store policy. "Single dad, just trying to make it work after a rough divorce. That's your story too, right?" Brandon nodded, maintaining the fiction that Lucas Grant was relocating for custody of his 8-year-old daughter. But as Leah shared her own story, the weight of his deception grew heavier. "My son Diego is 9, she said, pulling out a creased photo from her wallet. A smiling boy with bright eyes and a Batman t-shirt. He's been fighting leukemia for 2 years now. She taped the photo to her register where she could see it during long shifts. "The doctors say he needs CAR T-cell therapy, but our insurance company calls it experimental. $250,000 they want us to pay out of pocket." The number hit Brandon like a physical blow. $250,000. Less than he'd spent on his last corporate retreat, but an impossible sum for someone earning $12.50 an hour. "That's why I work doubles most days. Leah continued, her voice matter-of-fact despite the exhaustion in her eyes. 16 hours here, then I drive to the diner downtown for the overnight shift, sleep a few hours, then back here. Diego stays with my mother, but even with her social security, we're barely keeping our heads above water during their shift. Brandon watched Leah's survival strategies play out in heartbreaking detail. When the deli closed at 8 p.m., she carefully collected expired sandwiches and salads that would otherwise be thrown away, technically against policy, but overlooked by sympathetic co-workers who understood her situation. The expiration dates are just suggestions anyway, she said with a bitter laugh, tucking a day-old turkey sandwich into her purse. Corporate would rather see food rot in dumpsters than let employees take it home, but a girl's gotta eat. And Diego needs real protein, not just the ramen we can actually afford. That same evening, Brandon witnessed something that would haunt him for weeks. During their break, Leah opened a small pill organizer and carefully counted out medication, not swallowing the pills, but redistributing them into smaller compartments. Rationing insulin, she explained when she noticed his concerned expression. Insurance covers most of it, but not the rapid-acting kind Diego needs for his treatment days, so I stretch what we have. She looked up at him with tired eyes. Funny how a company that talks about feeding families in their mission statement makes it so hard for their own workers to actually feed their families. You know? The irony wasn't lost on Brandon. Those words, feeding families, had been his father's motto, later adopted as the company's official mission statement. Now, they felt like mockery. As days passed, Leah's protective instincts toward Lucas became increasingly apparent. She covered for him when he struggled with the new inventory system, claiming his mistakes as her own to prevent Derek's wrath. She shared her meager lunches, usually a peanut butter sandwich and an apple, insisting he looked too thin and needed proper nutrition. "You're too gentle for this place," she told him one afternoon after Derek had publicly berated him for moving too slowly. "Most guys who've been through rough divorces come out angry at the world, but you still care about people. I can see it in how you help the elderly customers, how you make sure the kids get their candy from the top shelf." Her faith in his fundamental goodness made Brandon's deception feel increasingly unbearable. Here was a woman sacrificing everything for her son, working herself to exhaustion, rationing medication and eating expired food. Yet she still found energy to protect and nurture a co-worker she believed was struggling just like her. One evening, as they cleaned up after closing, Leah shared the most devastating truth of all. "You want to know why nobody complains to corporate about the conditions here?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Because hungry people don't unionize, desperate people don't make waves. They've got us exactly where they want us. Too scared to lose what little we have, too exhausted to fight for what we deserve." She gestured toward the empty break room with its broken microwave and malfunctioning water fountain. "Last guy who tried to organize workers for better conditions? They transferred him to a store 3 hours away, claiming it was operational necessity. His kids had to change schools. His wife lost her job because she couldn't commute that far. The message was clear. Speak up, and we'll destroy your entire life." Leah paused, studying Brandon's face in the harsh overhead lighting. "But maybe someone like you could be different. Someone who hasn't been ground down by this place, yet someone who still believes things can change." The hope in her voice broke something inside Brandon. She was looking at him as a potential ally in a fight against the very system he had created, and she had no idea she was trusting the architect of her own oppression. On April 12th, Brandon made a decision that would change everything. Using his janitorial credentials, a role he'd volunteered for to gain access to assets, he slipped into the store's back office at 11 p.m. What he discovered in the computer files made him question whether his company had crossed the line from corporate indifference into outright criminality. The wage theft was systematic and staggering. Monthly shrinkage charges were being deducted from employee paychecks. $18,500, 0 cents every month, from workers who could barely afford groceries. These deductions, supposedly for inventory loss and register shortages, violated federal labor law. Employees like Leah were unknowingly subsidizing corporate losses, with money they desperately needed for rent, medication, and food. But the financial manipulation went deeper. Store 487 maintained two completely different sets of books. The versions sent to corporate headquarters showed profit margins of 8%, respectable but not excessive. The internal records revealed the truth: 23% profit margins, achieved through vendor kickbacks disguised as slotting fees, systematic overcharging through mislabeling, and wage theft that would have made robber barons blush. The vendors were being extorted. Local suppliers who had partnered with Hartwell stores for decades were now forced to pay bribes just to maintain shelf space. One email thread showed a small dairy farmer being squeezed for an additional $3,000 0 monthly partnership fee, or face losing his contract entirely. His family's only source of income. As Brandon scrolled through months of correspondence, his internal war intensified. Every day he watched Leah arrive early, stay late, and treat him with genuine kindness she couldn't afford to give. She brought him coffee during breaks, insisting that someone going through a tough divorce needed looking after. She didn't know that each act of generosity was directed toward the man ultimately responsible for her suffering. The moral weight was crushing. Revealing his identity would end the investigation, but also destroy any trust Leah had placed in him. Continuing the charade meant watching her struggle while possessing the power to change everything. Each shift became an exercise in guilt as she shared stories of rationing Diego's medication while unknowingly confiding in the person who could authorize full medical coverage with a single phone call. What would you do if you discovered your actions were hurting the very people you cared about? This story is about to take an incredible turn. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next. But the discovery that finally broke Brandon's resolve came buried in an email thread from Regional VP Miles Donovan. The subject line read, "Recalled product disposal, tax optimization. 4,000 pounds of peanut butter had been recalled by the FDA due to potential salmonella contamination. Instead of following proper disposal protocols, Donovan had ordered the product to be donated to Cedar Ridge Homeless Shelter, not out of compassion, but for the tax write-off value, claiming charitable donation credits while knowingly distributing potentially lethal food to the community's most vulnerable population." The email chain revealed the calculated cynicism behind the decision. "Homeless populations rarely pursue legal action for food illness," Donovan had written. "The shelter will be grateful for the donation, will get the tax benefit, and disposal costs are eliminated. Win-win-win." Brandon stared at the screen in horror. His company wasn't just exploiting workers, it was literally putting human lives at risk for accounting advantages. People could die from consuming that contaminated peanut butter, and Miles Donovan had factored that possibility into his cost-benefit analysis. The final email in the thread, sent just hours earlier, confirmed that the donation had been completed. Somewhere in Cedar Ridge, families experiencing homelessness were potentially eating poison that bore the Hartwell Green label, while corporate accountants celebrated the tax savings. Sitting alone in the flickering light of the computer screen, Brandon realized he had become everything his father warned him against. The company built on feeding families, not corporations, was now literally poisoning families to feed corporate profits. The investigation was over, not because he'd learned enough, but because he couldn't live with himself knowing what he knew while doing nothing. Tomorrow he would have to choose between preserving his cover and preserving his conscience. But tonight, for the first time in weeks, his path forward was crystal clear. The man who had built a grocery empire by putting people first was about to remember why that principle mattered more than any profit margin. The time for hiding behind Lucas Grant was over. Brandon Hartwell was about to face the consequences of what his company had become. April 17th arrived gray and tense. At 7 a.m., Every employee at store 487 received the same message. Mandatory meeting at 10 a.m., attendance required, no exceptions. 89 workers gathered in the loading dock area, whispers spreading like wildfire about impending layoffs or store closure. Financial struggles at corporate level, new automation that would eliminate jobs. The fear was thick enough to cut. Leah stood near the back, still wearing her name tag from the morning shift. She caught sight of Lucas, pale, nervous, standing apart from the other workers. Something about his expression worried her. He looked like a man preparing for execution. Store manager Brenda Walsh stepped forward with her usual clipboard, but before she could speak, Lucas moved toward the front of the crowd. Workers parted, confused by this new guy's sudden boldness. Leah felt her heart skip. Was he about to get himself fired by causing trouble? Then Lucas did something nobody expected. He removed the colored contacts that had hidden his green eyes. He wiped away the makeup that had aged and disguised his features. When he straightened to his full height and spoke, his voice carried an authority that had been carefully hidden for 2 weeks. "My name isn't Lucas Grant," he said, his words cutting through the murmurs. "I'm Brandon Hartwell, CEO of Hartwell Green Consortium, and I've failed every single one of you." The loading dock fell dead silent. Leah felt the blood drain from her face as her world tilted off its axis. The gentleman she'd protected, shared meals with, worried about, the struggling single father she'd grown to care deeply for, was the billionaire CEO whose policies had created their hell. "For 2 weeks I've worked alongside you as Lucas," Brandon continued, his voice shaking with emotion. "I've witnessed systematic wage theft, safety violations, and management corruption that violates everything this company was built to represent. I came here to investigate anonymous complaints. What I found was a betrayal of every value my father taught me." Without pause, he turned to address the management team directly. "Derek Lowe, you're fired immediately for intimidation tactics and safety violations. Store manager Brenda Walsh terminated for enabling fraudulent practices. Regional VP Miles Donovan will be dismissed by phone within the hour for endangering public health." Gasps erupted throughout the crowd. Workers who had lived in fear of these very people watched them walk away in shame and disbelief. "Effective immediately," Brandon announced, "this company will pay $2,100,000, 0 cents in back wages, stolen through illegal shrinkage deductions. Every employee will receive their fair share, based on documented theft from your paychecks." But then his eyes found Leah in the crowd, and his voice became intensely personal. "Leah Torres," he said, stepping closer to where she stood frozen. "You showed kindness to a stranger you thought needed help. Your son Diego will receive the best possible medical care at Johns Hopkins Medical Center, fully covered by Hartwell Green Health benefits. And I want you to lead our new employee advocacy board, because workers need a voice in corporate decisions." Leah's legs nearly gave out. The man she'd fed expired sandwiches to, the co-worker she'd covered for when he made mistakes, the person she'd grown to trust and care about, he was offering to save her son's life while revealing he'd been lying about everything. As the crowd slowly dispersed, processing the bombshell revelation, Leah approached Brandon with tears streaming down her face. The anger she expected to feel was complicated by something else. The memory of genuine kindness in his eyes during their conversations. The way he'd listened to her stories with real compassion. "Was any of it real?" she asked quietly. "The man I got to know these past 2 weeks, was that really you, or just another corporate performance?" Brandon met her gaze without flinching. "Every conversation we had, every moment you showed me kindness I didn't deserve. That was the most real I've been in years. You reminded me who I was supposed to be. Lucas Grant was just a disguise, but the person who cared about your son, who admired your strength, that was me." Leah wiped her eyes, studying his face as if seeing him for the first time. "You could have revealed yourself after the first day and fixed everything," Why keep going? Because, Brandon said softly, I needed to understand the full scope of what we'd become. And because working beside you showed me what this company could be again. If we listen to the people who actually make it run. For the first time in 2 weeks, Leah saw hope replace desperation in her own reflection in his eyes. By June 2025, Hartwell Green Consortium had become unrecognizable from the corporate machine Brandon had discovered in Cedar Ridge. The changes weren't just cosmetic policy adjustments. They represented a fundamental restructuring of how business could operate when human dignity guided decisions. The profit-sharing program distributed 15% of annual net profits equally among all hourly workers. For someone like Leah, this meant an additional $4,200 per year, enough to cover Diego's medication without rationing. For the company's 31,000 hourly employees nationwide, it meant finally sharing in the success they helped create daily. Transparency became the new corporate standard. Every store now featured a digital portal where employees could access real-time financial data, profit margins, vendor costs, executive compensation, and budget allocations. The days of hidden books and mysterious shrinkage charges ended permanently. Workers finally understood where their labor created value and how that value was distributed. Leah's ethical sourcing task force revolutionized vendor relationships. Working alongside local farmers who had been squeezed out by previous policies, she helped establish fair trade partnerships that eliminated kickback schemes while supporting community agriculture. The small dairy farmer who had faced $3,000 monthly extortion fees became a celebrated supplier featured in store marketing campaigns. Wall Street's reaction was predictably harsh. HGC's stock price dropped 22% as investors balked at reduced profit margins. Financial analysts warned about unsustainable labor costs and shareholder value destruction. But customers responded differently. Same-store sales surged 19% by Q3 as communities embraced a grocery chain that visibly prioritized worker welfare over shareholder wealth. Employee retention improved dramatically. Turnover dropped from 78% annually to just 23%. Training costs plummeted. Customer service scores reached record highs as workers who felt valued began treating customers as valued guests rather than transaction sources. Brandon's store visits transformed completely. Gone were the choreographed spectacles where nervous managers stage-managed every interaction. Instead, he worked regular shifts at different locations, stocking shelves, running registers, and listening to frontline perspectives. These authentic conversations generated dozens of operational improvements that corporate executives never would have discovered from spreadsheets. The ripple effects extended far beyond grocery aisles. Other retail chains faced employee demands for similar reforms. Labor organizing efforts gained momentum as workers saw proof that corporate change was possible. Business schools began studying HGC's model as an alternative to traditional shareholder capitalism. Leah's leadership of the Employee Advocacy Board proved transformational. Monthly town halls gave workers direct access to corporate decision-making. Policy changes required input from frontline employees before implementation. The board's first major victory was establishing mental health coverage for all workers, a benefit that reduced sick days while supporting families facing medical crises like Diego's leukemia treatment. We're not just selling groceries anymore, Leah reflected during a board meeting. We're proving that companies can succeed by putting people first. Every receipt is a vote for what kind of economy we want to build. For the first time in decades, Brandon felt his father would be proud of what Hartwell Green represented. The company had rediscovered its soul by listening to the voices it had forgotten, the voices that had always mattered most. Brandon Hartwell's transformation from disguised CEO to authentic leader reveals universal truths that extend far beyond grocery stores. Every price tag we encounter hides a human story. The cashier rationing medication, the stock clerk working 3 jobs, the single mother choosing between rent and her child's medicine. These stories exist behind every transaction, in every business, across every industry. True wealth, as Brandon discovered, lies not in stock valuations or profit margins, but in shared dignity. When companies prioritize human well-being alongside financial success, both flourish. The old model of squeezing workers to maximize shareholder returns proves unsustainable when measured against customer loyalty, employee retention, and community trust. Systems designed purely for efficiency often erode the very values they were built to uphold. Brandon's father created Hartwell's Pantry to feed families, not corporations. Yet corporate growth had transformed that mission into its opposite, a machine that fed corporate profits while starving the families who made those profits possible. The most powerful lesson came from Leah herself during the first Employee Advocacy Board meeting. "We don't need a hero CEO," she said. "We need a company that hears the people it feeds." Her words capture the essence of authentic leadership. It requires vulnerability, genuine listening, and the courage to change course when systems harm people. This story challenges us to look beyond our assumptions about others. The next time you see someone counting change at a checkout counter, remember that dignity isn't determined by bank account balance. Consider the human cost behind corporate success stories. Support businesses that prioritize worker dignity over shareholder returns. Brandon's journey from boardroom isolation to authentic connection proves that staying connected to your mission requires constant vigilance. Success can become a barrier to understanding if leaders lose touch with the people their decisions affect most. This story proves that real change is possible when leaders choose humanity over profit margins. If this story moved you, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more extraordinary stories that show us what's possible when we choose to see each other's humanity. What's one assumption you've made about someone that turned out to be completely wrong? Let us know in the comments below.